You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
When we began to talk about the ritual of the Sotah, of the woman whose husband suspects her of infidelity, the woman whose husband is jealous of her, we mentioned the possibility that this is a beautiful, psychologically astute way to restore peace between husband and wife. That the sages must understand that this ritual cannot possibly have any physical effect on the woman. And yet, by virtue of the fact that she goes through it and she survives, her relationship with her husband is restored. So in other words, we talked about the possibility that the ritual might serve this purpose. But we've also come across the humiliation and the degradation of the woman involved. And when we looked at the 5th Mishnah of the first chapter, we learned the comment of the Rambam, of Maimonides. V'chachamim makpidim bi nevula uvi gnuta. The sages are scrupulous in her degradation and in her embarrassment. They go out of the way to embarrass her. And this theme of degradation and embarrassment is picked up again in the 6th Mishnah as we carry on through the first chapter. Haita mechusa bilvanim mechasa bishchorim. If she was clothed in white, he clothes her in black. He doesn't want her to look beautiful. Hayu aleha klei zahav ktaliot. If she was wearing gold jewelry or chains, nizamim vetabaot, nose rings or rings, ma'avirin mimena kadei lenavla. They take them from her. They take the jewelry away from her to degrade her. V'char kach mevi chevel mitzri. And after that, he takes an Egyptian rope. What is this about the Egyptian rope? Maybe this is a very special kind of rough rope. One of the commentators, one of the translations suggests it's a rope made out of reeds. But the Jerusalem Talmud actually wants to connect it to Egypt, the place. And it quotes a verse from Leviticus, from Vayikra, a verse that we read on Yom Kippur afternoon. So if you remember, on Yom Kippur afternoon, in synagogue at Mincha time, we read the list of forbidden sexual relationships. And this list begins with a mention of Egypt, K'masei Eretz Mitzrayim, like the doings of the land of Egypt. Asher yasheftem ba, which you dwelt in, lo ta'asu, you shall not do. There's something about Egypt which seems to be connected with adultery, with forbidden sexual relationships, with incest. Somehow we're commanded to keep away from the sexual practices of the Egyptians. And so it's interesting that the Mishnah says, Mevi chevel mitzri, he takes an Egyptian rope. And we'll see later on, by the way, that the sacrifices, the meal offering, is brought in an Egyptian basket. So this is not the only mention of Egypt in this Mishnah. And it does seem to be something to do with embarrassment and degradation. He takes, let's see what he does with this rope. Mevi chevel mitzri, he takes this Egyptian rope. V'koshro l'mala midadeha, and he binds it above her breasts. Now remember, he's already torn her clothes. So her clothes are not holding on to her. But he doesn't want her to be prancing naked through the temple. So now that he's torn her clothes, he's going to tie them on again, but with this rough rope above her breasts so as to cover her up. So she'll look a bit like she's kind of like a rag, like she's tied up in rags. וכל הרוצה לראות בה ורואה חוץ מעבודיה ושפחותיה. And whoever wants to comes and looks at her, comes to look other than her slaves and her maidservants. Because she's got no shame in front of them. She's not going to be permitted to see people who might offer her words of comfort, but the strangers can all come out and look at her. And all the other women are permitted to come and look at her. In fact, one of the commentators suggests that they're commanded to come out and look at her. And now we're going to quote this verse from Ezekiel that really backs up this idea. Shene Emar. And now we're going to have a quote from Ezekiel. V'niyasru chol hanashim. All the women shall be admonished, shall be chastened, shall be taught. Velo ta'asena ke zimrat chena. All the women are going to be taught not to do like your scheming. And this verse from Ezekiel is from a passage in which he compares the national disgrace of the people of Israel in cozying up either to the Egyptians or to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. He compares the national disgrace of the people of Israel to the disgrace of a prostitute cozying up to her lover. It's very graphic, very, very disturbing passage. But it's as if the Mishnah here is playing the reverse game. That the Mishnah is saying that this woman who's kind of tragically become involved with a man who's not her husband, or perhaps tragically her husband has become suspicious that she's involved with another man. I mean, the tragedy may be in her husband's head, not in this woman's behavior. But it's as if the Mishnah is focusing on this woman, all of the tragedy, the national tragedy of the people of Israel. And then the Mishnah continues. Bamidah she'adam moded ba modedin lo, in the measure with which a person measures, or perhaps the quality with which a person displays, modedin lo, with that quality they measure him. And it continues. Hi kishta et atzma la avera, she adorned herself for a sin, vehamakom nivla, and so God made her repulsive. Hi gilta et atzma, she exposed herself, vehamakom gila aleha, and God exposed her. Yarei chitchila ba'averat chila, she began the transgression with the thigh, v'char kach habeten, and afterwards with the womb. Lefichach tilke hayarech tchila v'char kach habeten. Therefore she's punished first in the thigh and afterwards in the womb. Ushar kol haguf lo falate, and the rest of the body does not escape. And if we had any idea in our minds that this is some kind of value-free test that would establish, something sort of charitably put in place to establish peace between husband and wife, if we had this in mind, if we had an idealistic view of the Sotah in mind, it's just not possible, I don't think, for anyone to retain that idealistic view in mind after reading this Mishnayot. The ceremony that we're describing here is a ceremony of humiliation and degradation and shame. It's a ceremony that is applied to someone who is not necessarily guilty. This is someone whose guilt so far is just that of suspicion. She hasn't yet drunk the bitter waters. She hasn't yet been tested by the bitter waters. And yet, even before she enters that test, she is degraded and shamed and humiliated. And it's not possible to read this Mishnah without some feeling of unease and shame that this is a ritual that the Jewish community put its women through. Perhaps the only thing that we should mention in closing is that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the transitional figure who led the people of Israel from temple times through the destruction to a new kind of Jewish religion in Yavne. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's the bridge really between the Torah of the temple and the Torah after the temple, he abolishes the ceremony of the Sotah because, as the Mishnah records, we'll see this right at the end of the tractate, the Mishnah records that men were not at that point free from sin. And at a point that men were not free from sin, it wasn't possible to put women through this ordeal. Now, whether men were ever free from sin, well, that's an interesting question. But as we're closing these two Mishnayot, we're closing them somewhat in shock and awe, and with a certain amount of dare I say shock, a certain amount of horror. We should probably close on the fact that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ceases the practice of the Sotah ritual in the 1st century of the Common Era, at around the same time that the temple is destroyed.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.